Our first story this morning, again, is perhaps a familiar one if you've joined us during Holy Week, if you've come to church during that holiest of seasons leading up to Easter. But again, it's all the more powerful in context, right? Jesus is in Jerusalem with his disciples for that great Jewish festival of Passover. It's that annual celebration of the liberation of their ancestors from slavery in Egypt. But this Passover was unlike the rest. You see, at this point, Jesus knows that one of his disciples will betray him, will hand him over to the police, who will take him to the Jerusalem authorities for a sham trial that will end in his crucifixion, his lynching. He knows that as all of this unfolds, one of his dearest friends, Peter, would deny even knowing him, not once, but 3 times. He knows that in his greatest hour of need, all of those gathered there around the table with him will flee in fear. And yet, even in that moment, Jesus loved them to the end and showed them what that love looks like. At the end of their meal, he, their host, their teacher, the one they believed embodied God like no one they'd ever met, Jesus got up from the table and took the form of a servant, a slave, really, in that time, and washed their feet. Can you imagine the tender tenacity of such love washing over them in all of their vulnerability, claiming them there in all of their glaring imperfections? Peter is so uncomfortable with this expression of love, with this, what he sees as a shameful reversal of roles, right? A person of Jesus' status and stature does not lower themselves to take on the form of a servant, to do something that was a slave's duty. No, Jesus, you will never wash my feet. That's beneath you. Peter, Jesus says, unless I wash your feet, you have no share with me. That is, you cannot live out this kind of love. You cannot be a steward of this radical countercultural love unless you have truly experienced the humbling and transforming power of it claiming you. Yes, fickle-hearted you, Peter. You who will betray me. Yes, you with your glaring imperfections. My love is for you, Peter. You might not be able to understand this now, but on the other side of your denials, you'll understand. And when I'm gone, the only way for you to have the courage and resolve to likewise offer this tenacious, tender love to a self-destructing world is to first let it wash over you and seep into all of your broken places. Have you let this love of God wash over your dirty, bunioned, calloused, imperfect feet? Have you let the God who loved Peter and Judas and the rest love you as you are? Forgive your failings, that shame and guilt that you struggle to let go of? I think Peter's reluctance here is quite relatable. Right? It's much easier for us to give rather than receive. Because to do so, to be on the receiving end, is to recognize that we have need, which most of us were kind of taught to deny, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get her done. You don't need other people. Just, they'll disappoint you. Just do it yourself. So to be in need, to recognize those needs, is a little bit of a shame around that for a lot of us. But Jesus is firm. Unless we touch the place of our own deep need, of our imperfections, and experience this love claiming us there, not shaming us, yet washing over us. Unless we do that, we cannot share it with others. You cannot give a gift that you have not let yourself receive. A new commandment I give you, Jesus says, just as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my followers. And this, in this season of stewardship, this radical, possibility-creating, history-transforming love, this is what we are called to be stewards of. This is our primary calling. Love. Period. Anything else, whether buildings and resources or creeds or dogmas and doctrines, any church that makes any of these into its primary focus, what it thinks it is primarily stewards of, is a church that has lost sight of Jesus and why it even exists in the first place. Because when this happens, it's not long before self-giving love is co-opted by self-serving greed and simply stamped with Jesus' name as if that does the job. And sadly, it's not long. It didn't take long after Jesus' death for that to happen. We see this, for instance, in the church that gathered in the Roman city of Corinth in this morning's letter from the Apostle Paul. Now, in the early church, the remembrance of the Last Supper, of what we just read taking place in John 13, it didn't involve stale wafers or tiny cups, certainly that you had to peel back and separate out. Instead, that grand banquet imagery that we explored last week, if you were here with us, that grand banquet imagery was fused with significance by Jesus' Last Supper, and what the early church shared was a full-on meal, an agape feast, they called it, a love feast. It was a weekly dinner shared by all in remembrance of the kind of love that Jesus modeled and invited them into. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Now, at the church in Corinth, very few were wealthy among them, although a few were, but most were quite poor. And so with no building of their own, the church in Corinth, like all of the early churches, gathered in the homes of some of its wealthier members, those who had the space to host the group, right? But before long, these love feasts were anything but a modeling of the love of Jesus. You see, while the poor and working class labored into the evening at their jobs, the wealthy, who had more control over their time, their lives, well, you know what? They didn't like waiting so much, and so they would get there early. And apparently, as they did, they started to eat the food, the best food, and drink all of the wine, getting drunk, as Paul says, before the others could even arrive, who were then left when they showed up to this love feast with little more than scraps. And so rather than their faith challenging, dehumanizing cultural values and habits, rather than their faith transforming their actions, you see, they simply treated the church as one more place for them to use their power and wealth to reassert their status over others. Sadly, that wouldn't be the last time this happened in the church. Needless to say, Paul would have none of this. If that's what you're going to do, he says, don't even eat the Lord's meal. Don't even come. Because now, this is what people will associate with the church, with Jesus and what he offers. To act in these kinds of ways, he tells them, is to distort and disfigure the very thing, this love of God that you claim to represent. Perhaps if Paul were here today, he would say something to the churches of the United States along the lines of what what Friedrich Buechner has said. Buechner was one of the great Christian thinkers and writers of the 20th century, and he passed away recently. And as I was reading some commemorations to him, I came across this one passage about how he didn't grow up Christian, and he was in many ways, like the Apostle Paul, an unlikely and reluctant one. And yet, try as he may, he could not finally resist this force at the heart of the universe beckoning him into a new kind of life through Jesus of Nazareth. And so he found himself, though, in time that he mostly stopped worshiping regularly in a church because he said it seemed like most had lost any real depth or conviction. Like the church in Corinth, when he would go there, it seemed like many had traded the life-giving love of Jesus for membership in a social club of people just like themselves, or used it as one more bully pulpit for reasserting their power and privilege. So he said to these churches when he would visit them, he recounts this on several occasions, how he said, you know what, the very best thing that could happen to your church is for it to burn to the ground and for your minister to be run over by a truck so that you have nothing left except each other and God. And then I say, if you want to know what that original church was like, go to an AA meeting. It's perhaps a bit overly dramatic, or maybe not. But I think what he's getting at, what he's provocatively trying to raise before us is something that, like Paul's strong words to the church in Corinth, we need to hear. Because our world doesn't need any more churches if all it means is getting us into heaven or pitting us against people of other religious traditions or lack thereof. If all it means is taking care of ourselves to the neglect of the world around us. If our spirituality is merely a tool to help us feel better, to soothe our own souls. If church is about socializing with people just like us without at the same time calling us into new ways of being and challenging us to cross social and cultural boundaries and form communities across differences, our world doesn't need any more churches, including our own, if our hope offers no life-giving word to our struggling neighbors. You see, nourished at this table in this sanctuary by God's love, we are called to go out and feed others, to prepare a table not just in the sanctuary and wait for people to come here, but to build tables out in the community where people can find belonging and connection, where they can find healing and hope, can find a home. And we are here as a church, as gathered community, to embody and steward a vision of extravagant love, to practice generous justice toward one another and toward our world, inexhaustible mercy and radical belonging. We are here to receive and experience this for ourselves, so that, like Peter, having been washed in it, having been fed by it, we have the courage and resolve to steward that bold mission of putting that vision into practice in the world. Now, I know that like any and every church, including, as we just saw, those in Scripture, we have not always lived into that vision well. And yet, by God's grace, through the storms of the past several years, I believe we have found this divine spark again. I've heard people making mention of it. As we retell the story of our founding as an abolitionist church in the years leading up to the Civil War, of our earliest leaders serving as stopping points and conductors on the Underground Railroad, we are finding new courage and inspiration to ask ourselves, what it might look like to live such a bold commitment to loving people as Jesus loved in our own time and place. Such love and faith has found expression as we've responded to some of our world's most pressing crises as they've manifested right here in DeKalb County. In the chaos of the early months, as I've told this story time and time again, but I keep doing so because we need to keep hearing it, how in those early months of the pandemic, while we were already in a campaign to raise $350,000 to replace our aging and leaking roof, we still, in the midst of that context, committed to paying forward our stimulus checks. Those of us who felt like we had enough, like we could, in order to create a mutual aid fund, and we raised $20,000, which through local partnerships we were able to get quickly to our most vulnerable neighbors, largely our undocumented neighbors. While many churches continue to proclaim judgment, or at least stay silent on issues, a judgment against those who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, a prejudice that continues to shape death-dealing legislation all over the country, we have found ways to partner with organizations like the Queer-Oriented Rural Resource Network to raise awareness about such legislation while raising crucial blood donations during a historic blood shortage. And in doing so, made it clear that our church is a sanctuary of love and justice and belonging for all, period. And we are committed to doing the work required to truly keep living that out. We've written cards to our elected officials imploring them to do more to end the senseless gun violence terrorizing our children and communities. We've partnered with community organizations to get supplies to vulnerable youth who would not otherwise have them as they start the school year. As we've grown this reputation in the community, I've been invited to speak about justice at community rallies for voting rights and at public worship services addressing racial injustice, and to honor and remember the lives of trans people killed by anti-transgender violence. And here's what I think. I think we're only just getting started. I see so much possibility to keep growing and extending this table of God's love, and I know that there are so many in our wider community seeking just such a table to be part of, to belong to offer oneself at. The question for us in this season of stewardship is, in the year ahead, will we remain committed to this vision? Will we, like Jesus, continue to boldly prepare a table of belonging that includes those whom other Christians or our wider society say don't belong? Will we, like Jesus' disciples, be open to being challenged, to being changed from the inside out, to be washed in this love for ourselves? Or perhaps to put the question a bit more precisely, when it comes down to it, the question really is, what will each of us pledge? What will each of us commit in time and presence, in passion and talent, and, of course, in finances to make this witness possible? Because it won't just happen. It is up to us to build this table, to make this vision a reality. May it be so for our healing and flourishing, for the healing and flourishing of all the world. Amen.